we have almost an $800 billion a year trade deficit.
US trade deficit is nothing new. The Americans diving in with the arrogance that we're running the trade surplus and we don't want to be controlled got us into the situation we're in now. And I think I know what one thing that motivates Donald Trump, have his name used for the rest of eternity. He might actually like this idea. US trade deficit is nothing new. But why have we had it for so long? Why has it been a feature of the post-World War II architecture that we're in this dilemma? And the reason is of what happened at Bretton Woods. Because at Bretton Woods, which was the conference where the Allies came together to discuss what the structure of the post-World War financial system would be, just as in 1944, the proposal that was put forward by the British, and particularly led by John Maynard Keynes, was for an international system he called the Bancor. We didn't get that. We got what the Americans wanted instead. What Keynes wanted to do was to replicate the structure that applied in individual nations at the global level, as discovered some decades later by an Italian economist called Augusto Graziani. And Graziani started from the point of view of saying, how does a monetary system differ from one using barter? So it's a logical system. So if you take a look at what the conventional textbooks teach, neoclassical textbooks, which are a waste of time, what they tell you is the trade is barter. So what they have is two agents. We've got agent A here who wants to flog a camera. We've got agent B here who wants to flog an apple. Okay, so you've got two agents and two goods, one relative price between two goods. That's what the textbooks will teach you goes on in trade. Now the real world, which is what Graziani explained beautifully in that logical derivation of what a monetary economy is, you have three agents, a buyer, a seller, and a bank. There's one good and there's one monetary price. And what actually happens is a triangular relationship. There's a monetary transfer from the buyer to the seller, and in return, the seller transfers the good across. And then if you have more banks involved, then you need a central bank to enable the transfers to occur as well. So that's how a sensible monetary system is designed. And Keynes basically realized the same thing, that part of the chaos of the pre-World War II financial system was the fact that they used the British pound for international trade. The British pound got overvalued, British manufacturing became more expensive. So Keynes wanted to get away from all that stuff, and he said, we can do it by establishing effectively an international bank which just works on the principle that sum of all financial assets and liabilities is zero. Apply that at the international level. He wanted to have the closed system using a special currency that he called a Bancor. Now, I've facetiously said maybe we should call it a Trump, because we need a system like this and we need political leaders to want to get to that system. And I think I know what one thing that motivates Donald Trump, have his name used for the rest of eternity. He might actually like this idea. If you look back at what happened during the Great Depression, policies that the countries were doing to try to avoid the serious downturns that their neighbours were having was by trying to run an export surplus. And the idea here was that each country's would be looking at its aggregate balance rather than looking at China's surplus and America's deficit. And Keynes wanted to make that trade imbalances as small as possible. So the proposal was to have an international clearing bank. All central banks have accounts with that clearing bank. If anybody get United States dollars, they have to make the application through their own central bank. And each bank would be allocated an index quota, a quota based on the sum of their exports and imports. So you look at the scale of exports and imports by each country and give them half that sum as their quota. Either a surplus by exporting more than they imported in the aggregate, or a deficit importing more than they export in the aggregate, they would have to pay interest to the fund. And then that interest would be transferred to developing countries as a form of development aid. The only countries running a balanced trade would not face interest payments. The ones running unbalanced payments would pay the interest rate penalty, and that would then help developing countries. And in fact, the way it would help them would actually help both the deficit and the surplus countries, because the only way these interest payments could be spent is by buying goods from other countries. So that was the idea. You had an internal stabilizing mechanism. You have pressure on countries, whether they're surplus or deficit countries, and that was the way of stabilizing the entire system. And another major thing that Keynes wanted was to stop international currency transfers to evade taxation systems. It's a dog's breakfast of attempts to evade national taxation and so on. Now, it would have achieved an arbitrage-free system for international trade. At the moment, with the system we have, America can exploit that arbitrage. It creates the currency needed for international trade. It can then hand over American pieces of paper and get goods back, and some Americans think that's a good thing. A far better system if Keynes had won. It would have replicated what Graziani saw as the structure of a sensible monetary economy at the international level. And this, again, the idea of all transactions transactions being triangular. So you'd have the International Clearing Union at the top, central banks as parties to the International Clearing Union, and then private banks as parties to the central bank, and private buyers as parties to the private banks. And therefore you have these independent circulation systems. You'd have US dollars circulating amongst US buyers, Chinese yuan circulating amongst Chinese buyers. The US reserves would transfer between US banks, Chinese reserves between Chinese banks, and at the national level, the Bancors would transfer from one account to another account at the Bancor. So that's what Keynes wanted us to have. We didn't get it because he lost the intellectual and basically the power debate to Harry Dexter White, who was the United States major representative at the Bretton Woods conference. And so rather than getting the Bancor and the International Clearing Union, we got the United States dollar tied to gold at $35 an ounce. And it was almost the opposite of what Keynes's plan was. I know some people read a bit about a gold standard into the way that Keynes described the Bancor. That's just not understanding Keynes. They lost the battle, and there's a brilliant book on what actually transpired at that conference by Ben Stell. I recommend it for anybody who wants to get deeply into this topic. And the reason that Harry Dexter White and the United States, they wanted the United States dollar to be used for international trade was Keynes's proposal was going to penalise surplus nations. And America at the time was the leading surplus nation. They didn't want to pay that penalty. What happened to that trade surplus? This is the point that's made by Trump's main economic advisor, Steve Moran, that over time, because the American dollar was required for international trade, there was demand for the dollar over and above the demand for American goods. Way back at the time of the conference, America was running a trade surplus of almost 5% of GDP. It managed to flatline for some years after that, 40s and early 60s and 70s, but it's been all downhill since then, and now America's regularly running a trade deficit of 4% of GDP or larger. So be careful what you wish for. Now, I want to show what this looks like, Keynes's idea, in my software package Ravel. So what I've done is I've taken Keynes's ideas and put them into a system that has to have all these tables to show the entire intricacy of financial transactions. That's the International Currency Union. I've then got the treasuries for the deficit countries, surplus countries, and developing countries, the central banks, the private banks, and the private sector themselves. That's the level of detail you've got to go into. So Keynes's idea was you'd have zero balances to start with. There would be no money at the international level. The Bancor was just a unit of account. It couldn't be created or destroyed. But if you ran a sustained trade deficit, you would run up an overdraft at the ICU. If you ran a sustained surplus, you'd run a credit balance at the ICU. But in total, all the deficits and all the surpluses of all the nations would sum to zero. So there'd be no change to the equity of the International Clearing Union in this process. So deficit countries would run up a deficit. That can be a temporary thing for some countries. The main concern Keynes had was countries running sustained deficits or sustained surpluses. If you ran a sustained surplus, you put an interest charge on that. That interest charge would go into a reserve fund. Equally, a sustained deficit causes an interest payment into the reserve fund. And the reserve fund is then transferred to the developing countries, which are then enabled by that transfer to buy goods off the deficit countries and buy goods off the surplus countries. Now, what happens at the level of the country itself? And this, the only way you can answer these debates about money properly is to see it in double entry bookkeeping terms, and the only program that enables you to do that is my software Ravel. This is the tool you need to get through that confusion. What I've shown at the level of a central bank for a country running a deficit, because it's running a deficit at the International Clearing Union, it also runs a deficit in its own domestic currency. Treasury actually has to pay the interest payments, and that's similar to what happens now with governments running deficits. Then the reserves themselves enable third world countries to buy goods back off those deficit nations. So those interest payments are compensated to some extent by extra demand coming in from imports from third world countries. Now, at the level of the private banking sector, the fall in the reserves caused by a deficit causes a fall in deposits. And what's the reason for that? It's because when a buyer in America, say, wants to buy a Chinese good, they have to pass on American dollars to the central bank, which happens up here, and that is then used and converted by the central bank into Bancor. So a deficit reduces the amount of money in circulation. One of the main reasons Keynes thought that the Bancor system would work is that all countries, having been through the horror of World War II, wanted to come together and produce a coherent system to avoid those issues in the future. The Americans, diving in with the arrogance that we're running the trade surplus and we don't want to be controlled, got us into the situation we're in now. Now we can see what happens when you have a system of international trade where a national currency is used. It's been weaponized.
If you're like many other truth seekers and want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks, you'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to stevekane.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to stevekane.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.